Hey all, good day for all of you. Welcome to the second session of Linux series that we are going to start. And today is the first class in Linux. And today we are going to see what are the basic commands that how we can interact with the server and how can we start executing, the commands and the operations that we are going to do in the Linux box. So, so here I'm going to give a detail about how we are going to start executing Linux commands. What is the difference between Windows server and the Linux server? And in Windows, how can you work with your operating system? And in Linux, how can you work with your operating system? And let's see the comparison of that. So in Windows, right? So most of us will interact with graphical user interface. If you're going to create a file in Windows, a text file, you can create with your graphical user interface. But in Linux, we do have graphical user interface support as well as command line interface support. So we will interact most of our Linux operations with the help of command line interface, whereas when it comes to the Windows machines, we will interact with the graphical user interface and we'll create the directories, folders, we'll open the browser, we will install something by downloading, by going into the Google Chrome. And in whereas in Linux, right, we have a separate process for installations and separate commands that we need to execute for admin kind of tasks. So right, so let's get started with some basic commands on Linux, right? So, okay, so I have logged into my Linux box. So in the last class, I have shown you how to create a Linux server and how to log into the Linux server by using Oracle VirtualBox as a hypervisor and Vagrant as a tool, infrastructure provisioning tool. So we have installed Vagrant on top of my laptop, and I have spinned up a Linux VM, which is Ubuntu, CentOS, and I have logged into the CentOS server currently, which you are seeing on the screen. All right, so let's get started. So the very first basic commands that everyone has to learn and everyone has to understand to make a habit of everyday execution and everyday operation. So we are going to see that the very first command that we are going to execute is pwd, right? So pwd is a command, the abbreviation itself is present working directory. So we have I am currently in this path. So this is a path where currently you are resided in. So I have logged in as Vagrant user and I am in the home directory of Vagrant. So first of all, what is a directory? So directory and what is a file? So these are the basic terminologies and basic basic things that we see in Linux. So directory is nothing but a folder where you have a separate folder and you're going to keep all your files inside the folder, and you're getting into the folder and you're doing some operations inside the folder, opening the file, creating a new file or writing into the file and all the stuff. Whereas in Linux, right, in terms of Windows it is folders, whereas in Linux it is directories. So currently I'm in my home directory, right? So a pretty interesting note here: for every Linux server, you will be having a home directory for the user you logged in. So currently I have logged in as a user called Vagrant. So Vagrant is the default user for every virtual machine that is going to provision with the help of Vagrant. So what Vagrant does is, while the time of provisioning, automatically it will create a Vagrant user inside the VM. And it is going to boot up the server with the help of that user. And if you want to log into that particular server using Vagrant SSH, we are going to log in as Vagrant user. So that's where we are in. We are in the home directory of Vagrant. Now, so let's see the next command. Who am I? So of course, I'm able to see which user I'm in. I'm in Vagrant user. So for example, let's say I'm not using bash shell, right? I'm using some different shell. So as there are different shells in Linux, right? So these different shells is kind of K shell, burn shell, reburn shell. So different shells are there. So it is pretty important that which shell you're going to interact with and which commands you're executing on top of that shell. So shell is nothing but a utility which is having all the commands, and it takes inputs through the shell and it gives outputs through the shell. So it acts as an interface between user and your Linux machine when you are working, especially on command line interface. So when you have when you can identify that in which shell you're in, that makes your task simple to execute the relative commands to that particular shell. So most of the commands in Linux are similar, and it is quite identical for every shell that you're going to work in. So currently I want to know which shell I have logged in. So I'm going to see that with a command called echo dollar in caps shell, right? It says that you're working with a shell called bin bash. So I have logged into this particular shell and I'm working in this particular shell. I've logged into this shell with the help of a user called Vagrant, right? So now I'm going to work with the commands which are compatible for bash shell, right? So it doesn't mean that different shells is having different commands. The way of execution and the way of the process behind the commands execution is different when compared to different shells. So now we are in bash shell, right? So the very first command, of course, in bash shell, you can see that, okay, I have logged into Vagrant user, or if you, or else if you have some different user, I have logged into that particular user, you can see your username. But in different shells, when it say about K shell or Z shell or C shell, you cannot see your username. You can only see this dollar symbol which you are seeing on my screen at the cursor. Only this dollar symbol will be visible in some particular shells. At that point of time, if you want to know with which user you have logged into the server, you have to execute a command called who am I. So it says that, okay, man, hey, you are logged in with Vagrant user, right? If I logged in with different user, it is going to tell, okay, this is the different user that you have logged in. If you do who am I, it shows, okay, this is the particular user you have logged in. Let's see that example as well. So what I'm going to do is I will check. So this is a default CentOS mission, right? I'll try to check whether I have a default CentOS user, which is automatically created while the VM is booting up, or else if we don't have any default user called CentOS, we will create a user with user add command, and we will log into that particular user, right? So let's do that. So first I want to check whether we have CentOS user in the server or not. So for that, I'm going to use a command called sudo. Sudo is, it stands for super user can do anything. So he is the sudo, he's a power user. He's an admin user. When you have sudo in front of every command, so for example, let's say I'm going to execute a command called um, echo. So if I'm executing a command called echo, and when you are starting your command with sudo and you're doing echo, it means that this command echo is executing with all the root user privileges, all the root user permissions, right? So here I want to switch to different user, or I want to log in with a different user. So for that reason, so for switching into different user, I'm going to use sudo su. Su stands for switch user. And what is the username that I'm going to log in with? CentOS, right? So if CentOS user exists, it will switch to CentOS user. If it doesn't exist, it says clearly that CentOS user does not exist in the server. That means while creating the VM, CentOS user by default, it was not created by Vagrant. So I'm going to create CentOS user manually by using another command called add user CentOS, right? Permission denied. So that means, what is the tasks of adding user or deleting user? Who will do all these actions? Only the power user will do all these actions, right? So now I have logged into a user called Vagrant. So Vagrant is not a power user, right? When you want to do some actions with the help of a power user, either you need to switch to that power user. So the default power user in every Linux box is root. So to switch to root user, what we need to do? Sudo su space hyphen. That's it. So if you just execute this command, you will be logged into root user. You see, the name of the user root. So it has been switched from vagrant to root. So let's confirm that. Let's again execute the command, who am I? Right? I have logged into root user, right? So root user is the power user in Linux who can do every operation of administrative tasks. So now what I'm going to do, add user CentOS, right? So I'm going to add a new user into my Linux box, and the username is CentOS. When you execute it, yes, it's done. So we have executed the add user command as a root user. That means you're executing the command with sudo privileges, right? Sudo permissions. So that's how we can create a user. All right. So now if you want to switch to that user, directly if you do su CentOS, right? It doesn't ask any password. Okay, so since you are logged in as root user is having all the privileges. He can log in with any user and he can do all the administrative tasks, right? So what happens if we are in vagrant user? If I want to switch from vagrant to CentOS, is that allowed? So let's see that. So exit and again exit. Now I'm going to switch to CentOS user since CentOS is already exist in my server, right? Su CentOS. See, it is asking password. That means adding user just not gonna fine. You have to set up a password for that user to make that user more securable to log into any of the Linux box with his own credentials. So for that reason, what I'm going to do, I came out of this. Oh, oops, I came out of background server as well. So to log into the server CentOS, I'm going to execute a command again, which is vagrant SSH. It is going to take a minute or two, and then you will be inside the CentOS 7 mission. So let's wait for 1 minute. So in the background, it checks all the validations, whether the vagrant user is exist, the default user, and it is going to log in or not. And if you see, our terminal says the last login is on Tuesday. That means today, December 27, 2022. And this is the time when I was logged in, right? So now again, I have logged into the server and I'm going to set up a password for my user, the CentOS user, which I have added, and I'm going to set up a password for that user, and we are going to use a command called passwd, right? Password CentOS. So what it is saying, since Vagrant is not a power user, Vagrant is not an admin user, only root can specify a user name, right? If admin related tasks is only needs to be performed by the root user. No other user is having that privilege unless until you give privilege to that user, right? So I'm going to switch to root user again, sudo su hyphen, right? So I have logged into root user again. So now I'm going to set up a password or reset a password or change the password. So all the operations are same. You're going to use a command called passwd. PASSWD, and the user name is CentOS, right? When you hit enter, see, changing password for the user call CentOS, right? CentOS user password, we are going to set up a new password. So I'm going to give a simple password. See, so it is reconfirming the password again, and it is going to add the password and confirm the password for CentOS. And if you see this, authentication tokens are updated successfully. All right, so let's see now. Let's see by switching to the root user, switching to the CentOS user, right? SU stands for switch user again, CentOS. Oops, I'm in CentOS, but if you do pwd, where you are in the root directory, right? So pwd stands for present working directory. So when you are in root directory, right, the CentOS user does not have any permission, whether neither he writes nor he reads any files, right? So what it is saying, it is saying permission denied. That means CentOS user does not have any access levels for the root user home directory, right? So now for that reason, I'm going to just execute to come out of this home directory of root. I'm just executing a command called cd, change directory, and enter. That's it. So now you came out of root user directory, and if you do pwd now, you are in CentOS, right? You can perform any operation now. You can list the files, you can create the files, you can do anything, right? Okay, don't be panic. The ls command stands for listing the files, and the file touch command which you are seeing is to create an empty file, and the file name is file, right? And I'm confirming by executing ls command again to list the files, whether the file is created or not. Let's create some more files. Touch file 1. And if you do ls again, see, file 1 is created. Okay, so this is how you can create an empty file. And if you want to see the content inside the file, just use cat command, give the file name. You can see the content. I don't have any content. That means it is not giving any output for it. So now I'm going to insert some output. Don't worry about this echo command. I'll tell you in detail in coming sessions. So now again cat the file. Yay, we got it. We got some content, the word this. We have inserted this word in the file, right? This is how you can work with a basic Linux commands. We will see even more advanced sessions in basic Linux working commands and how can we interact with operating system, how can we create files, how can we delete files, how can we change the permissions of the files for different users, and what is the access levels that we can restrict in a Linux server. Everything we are going to see in detail in the coming sessions. All right, thank you guys. Have a great day. Bye bye.